26 American warships rested on the ocean floor. 164 more were torn open, burning, listing sideways in the Pacific swells. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were dead, not from submarines, not from battleship guns, not from mines, but from men. Men who chose to die. Men who strapped themselves into aircraft loaded with explosives and pointed their noses straight at the steel hulls of the most powerful navy the world had ever assembled. This was not a battle. This was something the world had never seen before. This was Okinawa. And by the time it was over, the United States Navy had suffered the worst losses it would ever experience in a single campaign in its entire history. Welcome to the story that most history books skip over. Welcome to the battle that nearly broke the will of the most powerful nation on Earth. To understand what happened off the coast of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, you have to understand just how far the war in the Pacific had already come. It had been 3.5 years since the smoke cleared at Pearl Harbor. 3.5 years of island hopping, of bloody beaches, of jungle warfare so savage it defied description. The Americans had fought at Guadalcanal, where malaria and starvation killed as many men as bullets did. They had stormed the beaches of Tarawa, where Marines waded through chest-deep water into machine gun fire and died by the hundreds in a single afternoon. They had clawed their way up through the Philippines, through New Guinea, through a chain of islands whose names most Americans couldn't even pronounce. And with every island taken, with every airstrip seized, and every Japanese garrison destroyed, the Americans had moved closer to the home islands of Japan itself. By early 1945, the end was visible on the horizon. But the Japanese knew it too, and they had been preparing something extraordinary, something desperate, something that would turn the final months of the Pacific War into a nightmare unlike anything anyone had anticipated. The island of Okinawa sits roughly 340 miles southwest of the Japanese mainland. It is 60 miles long and varies between 2 and 18 miles wide. It had a population of around 500,000 people, and it sat at the very doorstep of Japan. Taking Okinawa would give the Americans airfields close enough to Japan to launch massive bombing raids with fighter escorts. It would give them harbors to stage the largest amphibious invasion in history, the invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves. The American planners called that invasion Operation Downfall. Military projections estimated that it would cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Some estimates on Japanese casualties ran into the tens of millions. Okinawa, therefore, was not simply another island on the long road toward Tokyo. Okinawa was the last door before the final room, and the Japanese were going to defend that door with everything they had left. The American operation to take Okinawa was called Operation Iceberg. That name alone tells you something about the planners' sense of what lay beneath the surface. The invasion fleet that assembled for this operation was staggering in its scale. More than 1,300 ships, nearly 500,000 men. It was, at the time, the largest amphibious assault force ever assembled in the Pacific theater and one of the largest in the history of warfare. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, landing craft, supply ships, hospital ships. They stretched across the Pacific in a formation so massive that sailors on individual vessels could look out from their decks and see nothing but gray steel hulls in every direction. It was an armada unlike anything the world had seen since the Allied invasion of Normandy 10 months earlier, and in some respects it was larger. The men aboard those ships understood the scale of what they were part of. Many of them had already survived years of combat in the Pacific. They were experienced, hardened, professional. But what they were sailing toward was something none of them had ever faced before, because the Japanese had spent months preparing their answer. And their answer had a name. It was called Kikusui. It meant floating chrysanthemums. And it would rain down on the American fleet like nothing in the history of naval warfare. The kamikaze program had actually begun the previous year, in the fall of 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi of the Japanese Imperial Navy had looked at the situation his country faced with brutal clarity. Japan had lost the flower of its naval aviation over 4 years of war. The experienced pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had sunk the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, who had devastated American carrier groups at the Coral Sea and Midway. Those men were gone. Dead, mostly. The replacement pilots Japan could train were so inexperienced that they were being shot out of the sky in droves by American aviators flying faster, better maintained aircraft off carriers that outnumbered Japan's own by a ratio that defied comprehension. In a conventional air battle, Japanese pilots were simply being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Onishi looked at this equation and arrived at a conclusion that is almost impossible to comprehend from a Western perspective, but which made a certain terrible logic within the context of Japanese military culture and Bushido, the warrior code. If a pilot was almost certainly going to die anyway, why not make his death count for something definitive? Why not turn the aircraft itself into the weapon? A skilled American pilot could drop a bomb on a ship and hit it perhaps one time in 4 or 5 attempts under combat conditions. But a pilot who was the bomb, who guided his aircraft physically into the target, could achieve hit rates that conventional bombing could never match. The first organized kamikaze attacks at Leyte Gulf had sent shock waves through the American command. The escort carrier St. Lo had been hit and sunk. Other carriers had been damaged. The damage-to-aircraft ratio was shocking. And now, at Okinawa, the Japanese had had months to refine the program, to build up aircraft in hidden airfields across Kyushu, to train their pilots, if training is even the right word for what they went through, and to prepare the most concentrated kamikaze assault in the history of the war. The young men who volunteered, and it is worth pausing on that word, because the question of how voluntary the kamikazes truly were is one that historians still debate. The young men who flew these missions ranged in age from their late teens to their mid-20s. Many of them were university students who had been drafted into the military as Japan's manpower situation grew desperate. They left behind letters, poems, journal entries. Some of these documents survived the war and have been collected and translated, and reading them is one of the most haunting experiences available to any student of the Second World War. These were not monsters. They were not fanatics in any simple sense. They were young men, educated, thoughtful, capable of great tenderness, who had been born into a society and a moment in history that told them this was what honor and love of country required. Many of them wrote about missing their mothers, about regretting that they would never fall in love, about cherry blossoms and spring mornings and all the things that Japan meant to them. And then they climbed into their aircraft and flew toward the American fleet and died. Understanding this does not excuse the terror they created, but it is essential context for understanding what the American sailors were up against. Not just a weapon, but a human weapon, driven by belief and sacrifice that made it extraordinarily difficult to counter. On the 1st of April, 1945, April Fool's Day, the soldiers noted with grim irony, the American landing force hit the beaches of Okinawa. Hell Day, they called it. The landings themselves went almost shockingly smoothly. The Japanese commander on the island, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had deliberately pulled his forces back from the beaches. He had learned from earlier battles that defending the beaches against American naval gunfire and air support was suicidal. Instead, he had built an extraordinary network of fortifications in the southern part of the island. Tunnels, caves, reinforced bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and he intended to draw the Americans into that killing ground and bleed them there for as long as possible. The beaches were intentionally left lightly defended. This was a trap set in motion from the very first moment. But while Ushijima prepared his land defenses, the real horror was unfolding offshore. The kamikazes came in organized waves. The Japanese called each mass attack a Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. Between April 6 and June 22, 1945, the Japanese launched 10 major Kikusui attacks against the American fleet. In those attacks, they sent more than 1,500 kamikaze aircraft against the ships. When you add the conventional air attacks, the total number of Japanese aircraft committed to the battle was well over 3,000. The Americans had picket ships, destroyers, and smaller vessels deployed in a ring around the main fleet, whose job was to provide early warning of incoming attacks. These picket ships, positioned out ahead of the fleet, were the first thing the kamikazes saw when they came in low over the water. They became the most dangerous assignment in the United States Navy. The men who served aboard the picket destroyers at Okinawa experienced something that pushed the limits of human endurance. They were attacked, day after day, sometimes multiple times in a single day, by aircraft that were not trying to get away. An aircraft dropping a conventional bomb had to fly over the ship and then escape. A kamikaze just kept coming. You could hit it. You could put shells into it. You could light it on fire. And if it was still flying, if the pilot was still conscious, it was still coming at you. The destroyer Laffey earned a place in naval history on April 16, 1945. In the space of 80 minutes, the Laffey was attacked by 22 Japanese aircraft. She was hit by 6 kamikazes and struck by 4 bombs. Her crew shot down 9 of the attacking planes. 32 of her men were killed and 71 were wounded. The ship itself somehow survived, battered nearly beyond recognition, but still afloat. Veterans of that action described it later as feeling as though the world had simply decided to end. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The ship could maneuver, could fire every gun she had, and the attacks just kept coming, one after another, from every direction, from every altitude. The sound alone, the constant roar of aircraft engines, the hammering of anti-aircraft guns, the explosions, the screaming. Men broke down psychologically during these attacks in ways that were unprecedented. The Navy had to eventually rotate destroyer crews off the picket line because the sustained trauma was so severe. The USS Aaron Ward was another destroyer that entered the realm of legend at Okinawa. On May 3rd, she was struck by 6 kamikazes in the span of less than 2 hours. 45 of her crew died. Her superstructure was devastated. She was on fire in multiple places simultaneously, but her remaining crew refused to abandon ship. They fought the fires. They kept her engines running. They kept her guns firing even as men around them were dying. The Aaron Ward survived. The men who saved her received the Presidential Unit Citation, and the story of that day was told and retold in the Navy for decades afterward as an example of what human courage and stubbornness could accomplish against odds that should have been insurmountable. But not every ship survived. The carriers were priority targets, and several were hit hard. The USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes on May 11th in an attack so devastating it killed 393 men and wounded 264 more. The fires aboard the Bunker Hill burned so intensely that men on nearby ships could read by the light of them. Admiral Mark Mitcher, who had made the carrier his flagship, had to transfer his flag to another vessel. The Franklin, technically hit before Okinawa proper, had already lost more than 800 men in a single attack. The carriers that survived the campaign bore scars, patched flight decks, hastily welded hull plates, the permanent impressions of violence that no amount of shipyard work could ever completely erase. The British carriers operating alongside the Americans at Okinawa offered an instructive contrast. The British fleet carriers had armored flight decks, thick steel that could absorb a kamikaze hit and keep operating. The American carriers had wooden flight decks, which were faster to repair in peacetime, but catastrophically vulnerable to the kind of fire that a kamikaze loaded with aviation fuel and explosives could create. When a kamikaze hit a British carrier, the standard response from the bridge was reportedly something like, quote, "Bit of a prang, clear the flight deck." When a kamikaze hit an American carrier, The response was measured in hundreds of casualties and months in dry dock. The Americans took note. Future American carrier designs would incorporate armored flight decks as a direct lesson learned from Okinawa. The Japanese were not relying solely on kamikazes. They had another weapon ready, one so audacious in concept and so heartbreaking in execution that it has haunted naval historians ever since. On April 6th, the same day the first great Kikusui attack began from the air, the super battleship Yamato left the Japanese port of Tokuyama and headed south toward Okinawa. The Yamato was the largest battleship ever built. She displaced 72,000 tons at full load. Her main battery consisted of 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a ship, capable of throwing shells that weighed over 3,000 pounds to a range of over 26 miles. She was, in every physical sense, the most powerful surface combatant ever to sail the ocean. And she was sailing on a one-way mission. She had been given enough fuel to reach Okinawa, not enough to return. The plan, such as it was, called for the Yamato to beach herself on the Okinawan shore if necessary and use her enormous guns as land batteries, supporting the defenders until she was destroyed. She was sailing to die, and everyone aboard her knew it. The Yamato carried a crew of nearly 3,000 men. Many of them were teenagers. They sailed south through the East China Sea in a small task force, 1 cruiser and 8 destroyers, with full knowledge that American submarines had already reported their departure and that American carrier aircraft would find them. There was no Japanese air cover. There was no possibility of it. The American picket submarines and patrol aircraft tracked the Yamato's progress through the night and into the morning of April 7th. At 12:32 in the afternoon, the first wave of American carrier aircraft found her. In the next 2 hours, the Yamato was struck by at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs. She absorbed this punishment with terrifying endurance. Her designers had built her to take unimaginable punishment, but eventually the laws of physics asserted themselves. She began to list. Her captain ordered the ship abandoned, but by then communication had broken down across much of the vessel. Thousands of men were trapped below decks. At 14:23, the Yamato exploded. The magazines detonated in a blast so enormous that the mushroom cloud was visible from Kyushu, over 200 miles away. Of her crew of nearly 3,000, 276 men survived. The Yamato was gone, the greatest battleship ever built, sent to the bottom in under 2 hours by carrier aircraft. It was the final confirmation of something that had been apparent since Pearl Harbor, but was now beyond any debate. The age of the battleship was over. The carrier had won, but winning that argument cost blood. The American pilots who attacked the Yamato were not fighting in safety. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense. 10 American aircraft were lost in the attack, and 12 pilots and aircrewmen died. The victory over the Yamato was real, but it was not free. Nothing at Okinawa was free. Back on the picket line, the tempo of attacks was relentless. The men of the destroyer forces developed a kind of psychological vocabulary for what they were going through that is unlike almost anything else in American military history. Letters home from destroyer men at Okinawa describe a state of sustained hypervigilance that went on for days and weeks without relief. You could not relax. Ever. The radar might show a clear scope 1 minute and then, without warning, it would light up with contacts, dozens of them, and you had perhaps 3 minutes to general quarters before the first aircraft appeared on the horizon. 3 minutes to go from whatever you were doing, sleeping, eating, writing a letter, to manning your battle station and fighting for your life. Day after day, week after week. The longest Kikusui attack lasted multiple days. Men fell asleep at their gun stations from sheer exhaustion and had to be shaken awake while the attacks were ongoing. The medical toll was extraordinary. Combat fatigue, what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder, was reported at levels that alarmed Navy physicians. Men who had served without incident through years of combat in the Pacific were breaking down at Okinawa in ways they had not broken down before. There was something specific to this kind of warfare. The waiting, the radar track of something that you knew was a human being in an aircraft who had decided to kill himself by killing you. The intimacy of that in a way that conventional combat did not have. That got inside men's minds and stayed there. Veterans of the Okinawa Naval Campaign would report nightmares for the rest of their lives. They would flinch at low-flying aircraft for decades. Some of them never talked about what they had seen. Their families only learned the shape of it from historians who came decades later, piecing together records and diaries and after-action reports. The destroyers were not the only ones suffering. The supply and logistics ships, the amphibious vessels, the cargo ships, the oilers, were also attacked repeatedly. The kamikazes did not discriminate. They hit whatever they could reach. LSTs, which were the large flat-bottomed landing ships that carried tanks and vehicles to the beach, were hit repeatedly. Cargo ships loaded with ammunition were particularly terrifying targets, because if a kamikaze hit one while its holds were full of explosives, the result was catastrophic. Several ammunition ships were sunk or destroyed by secondary explosions that dwarfed even the initial kamikaze impact. The hospital ships were supposed to be protected under the Geneva Convention. They were painted white with red crosses, brilliantly illuminated at night specifically so they could be identified. It made no difference. The Comfort was a United States Army hospital ship, clearly marked, fully illuminated, sailing unmistakably as a medical vessel, when a kamikaze struck her on April 28th. 28 people were killed, including nurses and wounded patients who had already survived combat ashore. The attack on the Comfort generated outrage across the American military and home front, and it hardened the resolve of commanders who were already wondering how far Japan was willing to go. As the campaign on land ground into its terrible middle phase, the offshore battle continued without pause. The island's cave and tunnel defenders under Ushijima were extracting a horrific toll from American ground forces. The fighting on Okinawa on land was some of the most brutal of the entire Pacific War, and the need to keep supplies moving to the beach, to keep the naval gunfire support ships on station, meant that the fleet could not withdraw. It had to stay. It had to absorb the attacks. The commanders knew it. The sailors knew it. They stayed. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the American Amphibious Forces, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the overall Fifth Fleet, were under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. They had to support the land battle. They had to manage the defense against air attack. They had to deal with the logistics of keeping nearly 500,000 men supplied across thousands of miles of ocean. And they had to manage the psychological and physical toll that the sustained campaign was taking on their sailors. Spruance himself, one of the most composed and intellectually formidable officers in the Navy, would later describe Okinawa as the most difficult sustained operation of his career. He had commanded at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, at the Gilberts and Marshalls. None of it had prepared him for the grinding, relentless, day-after-day assault on the will of his command that Okinawa represented. The question of how to defeat the kamikazes was one that occupied the best tactical minds in the American Navy throughout the campaign. The early approach was largely reactive, more anti-aircraft guns, more ammunition, more fighters on combat air patrol. And the combat air patrol was indeed crucial. American fighter pilots, flying from the carriers, became the first line of defense. The F-6F Hellcat and the newer F-4U Corsair, arguably the finest carrier-based fighter in the war, were on alert constantly, scrambling to intercept incoming raids that could appear from any direction. The fighter pilots at Okinawa racked up extraordinary kill tallies, but the numbers of Japanese aircraft were so large that many always got through. Even if American combat air patrol destroyed 90% of an incoming raid, the remaining 10% could still cause catastrophic damage. Gradually, American tactics evolved. Fighter direction, the science of controlling interceptors by radar reached a level of sophistication at Okinawa that it had never achieved before. The radar picket ships, despite the horrific losses they took, were generating an unprecedented volume of real-time tactical data that allowed fighter direction officers to vector interceptors toward incoming raids with increasing effectiveness. By the later Kikusui attacks, the interception rate was improving. The Japanese were losing aircraft at a rate they could not sustain indefinitely. But the cost in picket ships and their crews was terrible. The night attacks were in some ways the worst. Radar technology in 1945 was not yet capable of supporting effective night interception consistently. Japanese aircraft attacking at night had a better chance of surviving to reach the fleet, and the psychological effect of lying in your bunk listening to general quarters alarms in the darkness, not knowing from which direction the attack was coming, not being able to see it, that was its own kind of torment. Night watch on a destroyer at Okinawa was described by veterans as the loneliest, most frightening experience of their lives. You stood your watch, you strained your eyes against the darkness, you listened to the radar reports on the headphones, and you waited. There were moments of dark humor, as there always are in war. Men who had been through multiple attacks developed a kind of black gallows comedy about their situation. There are accounts of sailors making bets on how long it would take until the next attack, of gunners who decorated their helmets with tallies of aircraft they had shot down, of cooks who kept serving meals through general quarters alarms with a kind of defiant normalcy that their shipmates found both absurd and desperately comforting. The human capacity to find lightness, even in the worst circumstances, is one of the most remarkable things about the record of this campaign. By late May and early June, the pattern was shifting. The Japanese were running out of aircraft. They had committed enormous numbers to the Kikusui attacks, and while the production of new aircraft in Japan had not stopped, the attrition was severe. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. American long-range bombers were attacking the airfields on Kyushu from which the kamikazes launched. And on Okinawa itself, the land battle was finally breaking the back of Ushijima's defense, though at a cost in American and Japanese lives that was almost incomprehensible. The last great Kikusui attack, the 10th, came on June 21st and 22nd. By then, the issue was no longer in doubt. General Ushijima committed ritual suicide on June 22nd rather than surrender. Organized resistance on the island ended. Okinawa belonged to the Americans. But the price? The price needs to be stated in full, because it is only in the full accounting that the true scale of what happened offshore can be understood. The United States Navy at Okinawa suffered 4,907 killed in action, more than double the number of sailors killed at Pearl Harbor. Another 4,824 were wounded. 36 ships were sunk. 368 more were damaged. Nearly 800 aircraft were lost. The destroyers and destroyer escorts assigned to the radar picket stations bore the brunt of it. Some radar picket stations lost so many ships that the Navy considered whether they could continue to be manned at all. The Japanese losses were staggering by any measure. More than 77,000 Japanese military personnel were killed on and around Okinawa. The civilian population of the island suffered catastrophically. Estimates of Okinawan civilian deaths range from 40,000 to over 150,000, a tragedy within the larger tragedy that is still mourned on the island today. Japanese naval losses included the Yamato and numerous smaller vessels. Japanese air losses were over 4,000 aircraft. The 10 Kikusui attacks had committed some 1,600 organized kamikaze sorties and countless conventional attacks. In the end, the losses had been unsustainable. What does it mean, that word unsustainable? It means that Japan could not continue to absorb these losses and maintain the ability to fight. But here is what makes Okinawa so significant and so chilling in the context of what came after. Even as Japan's losses at Okinawa were clearly catastrophic, even as every operational metric showed that the defense was failing, The Japanese military leadership was not moving toward surrender. They were preparing for more. They were hoarding aircraft, 10,000 of them, by American intelligence estimates, for the defense of the home islands. They were training more kamikaze pilots. They were building more of the small explosive boats, the suicide submarines, the beach defenses, the cave networks. Every lesson of Okinawa, every terrible, blood-soaked lesson, was being incorporated into the defense of Kyushu and Honshu. And the American planners looking at those numbers, looking at the casualty estimates for Operation Downfall, were looking at them through the lens of what Okinawa had just cost. If 36 ships sunk and 5,000 sailors dead was the price of taking one island 60 miles from Japan, what was the price of taking Japan itself? This is the context that shaped the decision about the atomic bombs. That decision remains one of the most debated in the history of warfare, and this is not the place to relitigate it in full. But it is impossible to understand why the decision was made without understanding Okinawa. The men who made it, Truman, Stimson, Marshall, King, had just watched what Japan was willing to do to defend its outer perimeter. They had the casualty reports from Okinawa on their desks. They had the intelligence estimates for downfall. The atomic bombs ended the war before the invasion that Okinawa had shown would be more costly than almost anyone could contemplate. Whether that was the right decision, and what the alternative counterfactuals look like, is a question that serious historians will debate for generations. But the decision was made in the shadow of Okinawa. Always in the shadow of Okinawa. For the men who served in the ships off Okinawa, the end of the war brought relief so enormous that many of them described it as a physical sensation, a weight lifting, a loosening of something that had been wound tighter than human beings were meant to sustain. The destroyer men who had spent months on the radar picket line came home to a country that was celebrating VJ Day and did not, in most cases, have any particular understanding of what the naval campaign at Okinawa had involved. The ground war on the island had received significant press coverage. The naval campaign was harder to photograph, harder to explain, less dramatic in the way that a beachhead or a flag-raising photograph could capture. The sailors came home, many of them, carrying what they had seen inside them, and the country moved on to peacetime, and the stories were not fully told for a long time. It was not until the 1990s and early 2000s, as the veterans of Okinawa entered their 70s and 80s and began to speak more freely about what they had experienced, as the culture around veteran testimony shifted and historians began to collect oral histories with real urgency before that generation was gone, that the full scale of what had happened at sea off Okinawa came into clearer focus for the general public. Books began to appear, documentaries, museum exhibits. The veterans of the Battle of Okinawa held their reunions, and historians sat with tape recorders and listened to men in their 80s describe, still with visible emotion, what it had been like to stand on the deck of a destroyer in the spring of 1945 and watch a Japanese aircraft come in low over the water and not stop. The Laffey survived the war and was eventually preserved as a museum ship at Patriots Point in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, where she sits today. Visitors can walk her decks and see the marks of her service, and read about what her crew endured on April 16, 1945. She is one of the most visited naval museum ships in the United States, and the people who walk her decks often report that the experience is different from what they expected, more personal, more immediate, more disturbing than a historical artifact is supposed to feel. Because she is not merely an artifact. She is a testimony. She and her crew looked into the face of something that the civilized world had never quite produced before. The organized, deliberate self-destruction of thousands of human beings as a weapon of war. And they held on. They held on, and they fought back, and they survived when survival seemed impossible. And the word for that is courage, even though it is an inadequate word for what it actually required. The Battle of Okinawa at sea was not the longest naval campaign of the war. It was not the largest in terms of forces committed, And it was not the one that shaped the strategic map most decisively, the way Midway did or the way the Battle of the Atlantic did. What it was, in terms of sustained intensity and human endurance, was the worst. The worst sustained naval combat that American sailors ever experienced. The worst toll on the fleet in the entire history of the United States Navy. The closest the Pacific War came to breaking the will of the men who were fighting it at sea. And yet they did not break. 4,907 men died in those waters, and the ones who survived did what sailors have always done. They stayed at their posts, they kept their ships in the fight, they did what needed to be done with whatever they had left. The campaign ended. Japan surrendered. The war was over. And the waters off Okinawa settled back into the blue Pacific quiet, covering the wrecks of 36 American ships and the bones of tens of thousands of men of both nations, lying still now in the place where the most terrifying naval campaign in American history was decided. We owe it to those men, to the sailors on the picket line, to the pilots in the combat air patrol, to the damage control teams who fought fires while other fires were still being set, to the young Japanese aviators who believed they were dying for something sacred, to the Okinawan civilians caught between two armies in a battle they had no part in starting. We owe it to all of them to know what happened there, to say their names, to understand what they faced. History does not ask us to agree with every decision that was made, or to celebrate every outcome, or to see the past without moral complexity. It asks us only to look clearly, to see what human beings are capable of in their worst moments and in their finest. Okinawa shows us both, at the same time, in the same waters, in the spring of 1945. Look clearly. Remember what you see. Do not look away.